Uh, Friends, I come from Montfort Social Institute, Hyderabad. I also the coordinator of the International Alliance of Inhabitants. Montfort Social Institute work in 12 different cities and towns in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana of South India. We work with the domestic workers. We have two trade unions. We have the Slum People's Federation in 2 cities. We work with the transgender community, and we work with children through inclusive children's parliaments in the slums. I intend to talk to you on evictions, but in the context of India, and how that impacts children. As we know, evictions and the impact of children is not really dealt with directly in the SDGs. Now, how do we bring that into the programs of the SDGs and the ambit of the SDGs? This, I think, is a challenge. Now, India is an extremely contrasting country. It's 1,400 million people that live in this country. 30% of the population in the country live in cities and towns. Around 30% of this population live in slums. Well, this is one aspect or one phase of India, but there is another phase to India, and that is can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and this is the other side of the urban context in India. These are slums, these are garbage dump yards, extremely poor situations, housing in which a large population in this country live. The next slide. In fact, I do not really intend to go into how the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Children, but then it does talk about, Article 27 does talk about that every child has to be given a standard of living that is adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, and moral and social development. This is a responsibility of the state and the state parties that in India India has ratified the convention, and India is bound to follow it. The next slide. The next slide. I don't intend to go into the now SDG we have already seen. Again, SDG 1.4 talks about to ensure that all people have access to adequate and affordable housing and basic services. It recognizes the importance of access to adequate housing and highlights the need to address forced evictions and other forms of housing insecurity. SDG 11, we just saw what SDG 11 has to tell us. Also, SDG 16, it talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions that would protect all citizens, but much more so children. Next slide. Also, the Constitution of India, all the rights, fundamental rights that the Constitution of India talks about are rights linked to the protection and guarantee of the human rights to adequate housing and land, and the fundamental rights often the Supreme Court of India and other higher judiciary has interpreted to show that children have a right to be protected. And housing in India is not a fundamental right, but India has ratified UN conventions that talks about right to life is also right to housing. The next slide. Yeah, one thing that is happening in the name of development, the current government came to power with the promise of development for all. And in the name of development, there's a huge number of evictions that are taking place, particularly in the recent past. I will tell you what it in the last 3-4 years, what has happened. In the name of development, in the name of large projects, there is the urban renewal and expansion of our cities and towns in the name of city beautification, sports, and other mega events that the country organizes, industrial development, and just land grabbing, because real estate values have shot up in the last few years. Privatization of the public goods, environmental conservation projects, and well, there are many issues that we have to that forces children onto the streets. Catherine was talking about children, and this is how often children come to the streets or have nowhere to be. Next slide. Just to tell you how the situation of housing in India. Over 4 million people are homeless. In other words, 4 million people who live on the streets of India. And at least 75 million people live in informal settlements in urban areas without access to basic amenities such as essential services, including water and sanitation. Just to give you an idea of what that means, over 36,486 houses were demolished. This was in 2021. And this is during the COVID year, where there was a very stricture from the UN saying that no eviction should take place during this period of disaster. At least 207,106 people were forcibly evicted during that year. At least 158 incidents of forced evictions were reported. Nearly 15 million people are currently living under the threat of eviction and displacement. In other words, 15 million people in this country live under constant threat of eviction, of displacement. We are told that at least 100 houses are demolished every day, and that is the type of evictions, displacements that happen. Next slide. This is just to show you some major incidents of forced evictions in 2022, and this is just 6 months. From January to July reveals that state authorities across the country demolished 25,800 homes, affecting almost over 100,000 people being evicted. Next. This is an overview of forced evictions in India from 2017 to 2021. If you look at 2017, that is pre-COVID, 53,791 houses were demolished, affecting 258,196 people. In 2018, 41,734 houses were demolished, affecting 202,233 people. And in 2019, 22,247 houses were demolished, affecting 107,625. Just to show you even how during the very thick of COVID, large number of evictions took place. Next slide, please. Okay. And now, how does it impact children? Evictions impact children. I can tell hundreds of stories to you. Children are become extremely vulnerable when evictions happen. Even as they are born or even before birth, there are poor birth outcomes that happen because the stress, lack of access to basic health facilities that is necessary, the environmental hazards. Now, I remember eviction happening in the thick of the monsoon season, pouring rain, people, a mother giving birth to a child in the pouring rain outside on the street after an eviction taking place, malnutrition, disruption of schooling. I know hundreds of thousands of children who leave the school with when evictions happen and they never come back to the school. Increased stress and anxiety. Children show extreme stress and anxiety symptoms, innumerable health problems, simply because they don't have a room or a house to protect them. The emotional trauma that they go through when bulldozers come and demolish the little houses that they have. Children are so malnutrition and their overall growth gets stunted. Increased risk of exploitation, especially girl children being exploited, being trafficked. Trafficking happens, increases manifold increase in trafficking that happens of especially young girls and adolescent girls. Disruption of the social networks because they are dispersed. The relationships that they had been building over the years as children, as youth, as adults, these get totally disrupted. Maternal depression that impacts children because mothers and often parents go into depression when their houses are demolished, and that impacts children extremely. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Now, in terms of recommendations, now there is tremendous stress, tremendous impact on children that happens. But as I said, SDGs, as we have it now, does not seriously adequately address children in the context of evictions. We have been asking for a zero eviction strategy from the governments, that no evictions happen, and if evictions have to happen for emergency situations, give them facilities and housing that is better than what they have to lose out. These are UN guidelines that we already have, and we have been insisting these with the states, that the governments, both at the central government, the federal level, and in the regions at the state level, actually implement these. The government must seriously assess the impact of the large number of evictions. See, especially during the evictions that happened during the COVID period, that has led to the death of hundreds of children in India. Hundreds of parents in India, they were thrown into the open with so little to protect them, especially when the COVID attacks became so rampant. And it is during that period that a number of evictions that took place. And we have been asking that the government must assess the impact of such evictions that happened during the COVID period, and must compensate, must take remedial measures for it. The state must follow international and domestic law in ensuring adequate housing for all. Well, there are big promises. There is supposed to have been, see, in the urban areas, officially, there is a lack of, there is a shortage of 18 million houses. And we were promised by that 2022, all of them will receive adequate housing. But this still remains a dream that is to be achieved, perhaps, I don't know, after how many decades more. So this is the context in which I'm talking about a typical case of India. In the city that I live in is Hyderabad, and such stories can be narrated from different cities in India. So I think it is important that such a dialogue is happening, and evictions is something that we must stop. We have been campaigning for zero evictions and the right of people to the cities. And these rights include the rights of children. And this is something that we must continue to campaign for. So thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.